I'm absolutely with Elise. I reckon autumn is the best time in South Australia beyond any shadow of a doubt. And everyone gets caught up in spring. It's just, that's a nuts time. Autumn has been, and we've proven it, I reckon, with March's results. Now, let's talk about things in South Australia with the CEO of Business SA, the man himself, Mr. Peter Vaughan. Welcome, Peter.
Good to have you and with us and enjoying the beautiful weather of Adelaide, Anthony.
And it has been sensational. Now, tell me about your retirement first. Let's get that out of the way. What's happening?
I'm retiring of my own choosing on July 1, so Elvis will leave the building.
Well, I must say, we'll try and get you on before you go because you've been a great part of our Took TV show.
Thank you.
Now, Pete, let's get straight into it. I've promised everyone a really frank discussion, good and bad and everything in between. What is going on in this state?
Well, it's been tough, and everybody would know that. It's tough for householders, it's tough for businesses. We've had the perfect storm of the high dollar, which means exports have really lagged behind. We've had interest rates on hold and therefore not being reduced, and we've got the highest interest rates currently in the world. And you've got businesses really tightening up because demand has dried up, people have got their hands in their pockets, and the banks have really been miserable, both in terms of not passing on whatever rate cuts, but also tightening up the lending regimes for both householders and businesses. So you've really had a perfect storm.
Peter, I was in the States when it all really capitulated over there, and I went to the worst hit. And one of the comments from the agents, that was 3 years ago, in 2008, 9, and one of the comments from the agents were the problem wasn't them selling a property to a client, to a purchaser. The problem was the client, the purchaser, getting funding, with the valuers undervaluing the properties way under the prices that they were achieving, with multiple offers on properties, and that was tanking the whole market. We're getting a similar effect here, I reckon.
Well, certainly, as I've said, banks have really not been everybody's favourite dinner party host or guest in the current environment. If you're a banker these days, you duck for cover, and quite frankly, so you should, because I think the banks really have an obligation, given the guarantees that were put in place by the federal government in the GFC in 2007 and 8, and that underwrote the banks and actually got money in to the big four banks, and that was based on taxpayer guarantees. Now, I think there's an obligation for the banking system in Australia to give back to our economy when you don't have the stimulus packages that we had in 2007-8, where everybody got money in their pockets, and you don't have the building education revolution, which put money in the hands of tradies, and that flowed through to the whole South Australian economy. That's all gone, but the banks have done very, very well. They've enjoyed record profits in the last 2 or 3 years, and I think there's a real obligation for them to bestow on us, that is the taxpayers, the benefit of that in part by easing off on their restrictions on lending, because quite frankly it's hurting everybody.
Peter, even if there's the interest rates one issue, but the big issue that we're finding in the marketplace is that we can sell a property, but the valuer is so scared of being sued that they are undervaluing the property to cover themselves, because they'll never get sued for undervaluing, they'll only get sued for overvaluing. Now, this is what's creating havoc in the market, because it's actually putting downward pressure. So it's actually the valuers then go back to the bank, and the bank say, well, you know, we're not going to cover that amount. That's been a real issue.
Anthony, this is all about risk. And it's what we're seeing is the banks, who have been very happy to take our money in the very good times, becoming more and more risk adverse in a country where the failure rate of mortgages is infinitesimal compared to anywhere else in the world, has been for 70 years. That's why we've had such a great record of housing people and putting people in housing, and that's why in markets like South Australia and Adelaide, people want their piece of their earth and their ownership. And really, banks have, I think, gone too far the other way, because they have had those guarantees, they have done very well, they haven't faced the pressure that the Euro banks and the American banks have faced, and they're not likely to because the regulations don't allow for that sort of excess, and therefore they could ease off, and really that should flow through the whole market and lift the market generally, particularly in residential.
Now let's move on from the banks. I'm very keen to hear your view of the world of the South Australian economy in particular, and then later in the show we'll do a market update where I'll get your predictions on property. But
Yep.
Tell me about the state. How good a state is the state in?
How are we travelling? Things are tough. The state budget, which comes down on May 31st, is going to also be tough, and the federal budget is going to take money out of our pockets. But having said all that, despite all the concerns and issues we've just talked about, unemployment rate is now matching the national rate of 5.2%. So there are still plenty of people in employment, 95% of people exactly, wanting to spend money, wanting to enjoy higher standards of living, wanting to trade their homes. They just need a trigger to do that. And quite frankly, what's really holding everybody back, I think nationally, is a failure of the political scene where people are not feeling confident about political leadership.
Do you think the carbon tax has been a real confidence sapper?
I think the carbon tax has been a confidence sapper, but also too, it's going to have a very negative impact on manufacturing and the whole flow through of our economy, and at a time when it's absolutely not necessary to do so, and will in fact push companies offshore because they'll be able to go to places where the regimes are not as rigorous and they don't have to pay the tax, and the net result will be we'll have carbon pollution going up in the world, but we will have less people employed. Now that is sheer and utter madness.
And Peter, what about the mining sector? There's been so much talked about, everyone's sort of almost completely over it. What's your real take on that?
Well, we've definitely had an exploration boom, and there's been a lot of activity, nothing like WA and Queensland, which are just going gangbusters. But the big $64 question is going to be BHP and Roxby Downs. They've got to make a decision between now and December. I believe that decision will be positive. Nobody's indicating the signs otherwise, and the result of that will be to create an enormous circuit breaker in confidence and general attitude in South Australia, because that mining impetus is going to set us up to be the jewel in the crown of the South Pacific for the next 30, 40, 50 years.
Now in a minute we'll do a market update, but I want the people out there listening to understand I'm going to come back to Peter in a moment when we do our market update and ask him whether we've bottomed out of the market. So Pete, we'll be back in a minute.
Thank you.
Now let's go to Going, Going, Gone.